Welcome back to another episode of COMTO Colorado LIT Podcast, otherwise known as the Leaders in Transportation Podcast. This podcast is really set up for you to be able to hear from some of the best and brightest minds in the transportation industry. And I am so pleased and honored to have a very special guest on our podcast today. This is the individual who's a former District Department of Transportation director. He was the former deputy executive director of Federal City Council, and he is currently the vice president of corporate strategy and innovation for Transurban North America. And I am so pleased and happy to have Mr. Emeka Monome here to talk with him and pick his mind. And full disclosure, this is one of my good friends and one of my mentors here in the transportation industry. So very happy to have you here on the COMTO Colorado LIT Podcast.
Eulois, honored to be with you. Thank you for the gracious introduction, and excited to have this conversation, just talk a little bit about what's happening in the industry and a little bit about how I got into the industry and move forward through it.
Awesome. So let's jump right into it. I gave a little bit of your background, and I'll tell a quick story of how influential Emeka was to me. I started with the District Department of Transportation back in 2009-ish, around there, 2008, 2009. But before that, I had a small stint as a business owner where I would go around and try to influence local jurisdictions to be more engaged around transportation-related projects. And I remember writing a letter to the then director that was then at the time, the DDOT director was Emeka. And I wrote a letter as I went through and dissected the city's budget around transportation projects. And I remember specifically that you actually took the time out and had one of your staff respond to a letter back to me. And I was just kind of a young kid start up there trying to make an influence, and it always stuck with me. But give us an idea of how you get into the transportation industry, your time there at DDOT and your thoughtfulness there, and kind of anything else occurred in your career to get you to this point.
No, Eulois, that's a really good story, and I think it's actually a really good place to start. I think the reason I ended up in transportation is I actually kind of fell into it, to be quite honest. I moved to DC in 2000 to be a part of Mayor Williams' Capital City Fellows Program. I was in the first inaugural class of this program to attract college master's degree students into the city's government. And I wanted to come to DC because I could see that DC was growing. It was about to grow, and I was all about cities. And so I interviewed, and they ended up putting me in the transportation department. And I think for probably 2 weeks, I was spent a lot of time wondering why they put me in some organization that I didn't want to be in. But very quickly, it became really clear to me that the lifeblood of the city, the way that the city grew, the way the city functioned, really did move through the transportation program, the investments that were made there, the way that the city operated. So that was the beginning of my love affair with the industry. And the other thing I'd say about that is that in the same way that you reached out to me, I was fortunate that I had a leader at the time that was also able to create room for young, hungry individuals that want to learn more about the industry. And so I was able to take on a ton of responsibility, get exposed to a ton of stuff at the very beginning of my career, and really set the path for me. And I've done my best to reach back as your story kind of reinforces.
That's fantastic. So you went from DDOT, and then you ended up taking a couple other stints out in the industry, and ended up with kind of another important role there in Washington, D.C. Kind of, how did your experience there in DDOT kind of prepare you for other leadership roles in the industry?
That's a good question. So, I was able to go to DDOT, and the great thing about the DDOT department is that it was multimodal, right? You were dealing with not just roads and highways and bridges, but you had a transit system, including Metro, that you had to be very engaged with funding and operations. We had freight issues that we dealt with at the department. We did have bodies of water. We didn't have a big water program yet and still, but there was an issue there. So there was a really broad landscape of transportation. And then on top of that, as I mentioned, the way the city was growing, real estate development was an integral part of the way that we thought about our role. How did we support real estate investment into the city? how do we make decisions about roadways and improvements to support that growth, to shape that growth in a way that was beneficial to the city. So after a couple of years kind of learning the department, I spent a few years in consulting, both working for the company that is now WSP, then Parsons Brinckerhoff back in the day, and then also at a public finance company. So it was really a company that advised states and cities on their finances and helped them structure investment programs for infrastructure and all kinds of programs. But it really gave me, I felt, a really good view as to the major stakeholders and supporters of state agencies. And so then in 2008, I was asked by then Mayor Fenty to serve as his transportation director, and then spent a couple of years at WMATA, to your point, working in the transit industry, and really probably one of the more formative times of my career, really seeing what one of the major transportation agencies in the country, how it works, its challenges, its 10,000 people and multi-billion-dollar budget was really a way for me to see the full breadth and depth and the complexity of that agency. And so, yeah, I think that those two, the DDOT experience and the WMATA experience, really, really formative. I also got to serve as a board member at WMATA, which also put me into kind of the regional political discussions about how do we fund and operate this agency across multiple borders, which, that's, as you know, in your role, that's one of the lenses that you have to develop very acutely to be able to, operate within quasi-political environments that infrastructure can be.
Absolutely. Yeah. You've had a plethora of experiences in a short period of time. And I remember, again, going back to the first time I met you, I'm like, man, this is the person that I want to model my career after. And so really, you served as a mentor to me and mentor to others. And it's been a pleasure to see you kind of navigate the waters there and doing different things. You started off in transportation, ended up in a development kind of role. You're now with the consultant group that kind of, I think, commingles a little bit of both. And it's just interesting to see how you've been able to meld all your experiences to get to where you are. So that's fantastic. Let me ask you a couple questions about your time there at DC, and just you were there at DDOT at a time where the city was growing. Washington DC was growing, and it's interesting. My role here in Denver, in a lot of urban areas, you're seeing significant growth patterns over the past decade or so. And I think DC was part of what I would say the first suite of kind of major cities that went through that growth pattern. What were your thoughts about kind of what transportation's role as it relates to trying to build out infrastructure to help support future growth? And then, what were some of the challenges with that? And really what I'm talking about is, the conversation around equity these days, which really results in all this public sector investment can potentially create gentrification. So in your role, how do you try to balance that? And then kind of what are your thoughts around how cities need to move forward to commingle the two, develop good transportation infrastructure, but at the same time trying to make sure that you're protecting the existing neighborhoods that exist?
No, that's a great question, and I've reflected a lot upon my time early on in the city. I think one of the things that was really central in my mind is that back then nobody had any vision of what DC could have become. Right? I think we were like, this is a city that was just trying to come back and get on its feet, and so that investment was desperate and needed. And I think that the lack of imagination about the negative impacts was a challenge, right? I think as we all look back now, certainly we know there's things that we could have done differently to kind of head off some of the challenges we've seen around the issues of equity, gentrification, its impacts on underrepresented or under-resourced communities. Now, I do think that one of the things that I would not do differently is that you do know that the way that cities grow and are able to invest in themselves, they have to have a catalyst. They have to have an engine of growth. And so, you're seeing the same dynamics in Denver. Your downtown is generating the resources to be able to do the investments that are going into the community to address some of those issues of equity. As they say, what do they say? It's better to have 50% of something than have 0% of 100% of nothing. And so I think one of the challenges is how do you marry driving investments, you can grow the strength of a city, but doing it in a way that protects. Now, I think back when I was the leader of DDOT, equity in my mind, it ended up being about, well, how do I make sure that all the wards, the different subgroups in the city are treated equitably in the capital budget? How do we make sure that we're investing in the neighborhoods in Ward 7 and Ward 8 and Ward 5 as much as we're investing in Wards 3 and Ward 2 and Ward 1, for just using the DC example? I think that we're a lot smarter. We have more information, and we're just a lot more aware about some of those other nuances that we weren't picking up back in the day. So the issue of, investing in non-vehicular transportation, and how we make sure that that's equitably distributed. And then being very specific, how do we make sure that communities that historically have not used those modes feel like that's an investment for them and not for others, right? And I think that's one of the dynamics I think we continue to struggle with in our cities.
Yeah, I'm gonna pick up on that point because this came up with another guest as well. And something that I think a lot of us struggle with is how do you explain, for example, a bike lane, a underserved community, a Black community,
yes,
and the reaction that I know a lot of folks have around what a bike lane represents,
exactly,
and whether or not that infrastructure is there for them. And I remember the times in DC where I think people thought it was a signal of gentrification. We get some of that here in Denver, but what is the appropriate response to something like that? During your tenure, the city was installing a ton of bike lanes and the like, and at a time where the transition demographically wasn't all the way there.
Yeah.
So what would your answer be to that question? Like, hey, I live in this neighborhood. I've been able to ride my bike in this neighborhood. I don't need no daggone bike lane, but yet you come in here and you're building this bike lane, and then all of a sudden I'm starting to see people that are moving into my neighborhood not look like me. So how do you respond to something like that?
No, that was a legitimate issue that I dealt with. I'll just say I personally struggled with that, right? I had a personal interpretation of what it meant. But at the same time, there was also a vision for the city. And I knew that for the vision for growth that we had for the city, you did need to find the capacity to move people throughout the city in ways differently than we did in the past. And so, you know what? All that I think that you can do is you do need to be able to find a way to connect with people and communicate with people. I'll give an example that I do think was one of the better things we did. So many people may have heard of it, the 8th Street corridor in DC. It's one of the corridors coming out of downtown that was really severely impacted after the 1968 riots in DC. The pictures, it really was kind of ground zero in many respects for the unrest and the anguish that the community expressed. And so as that neighborhood was redeveloping, one of the best things that I think the city did, I won't say they got it perfect, but there was an intensive effort to actually connect with people on a personal level and explain why we're doing what we're doing. We're not just doing it because we want to have another family, another group of people come in, but these are the things that we want for your community. We want to be able to bring the type of sit-down restaurants or retail stores that you require. And this is what they're saying that they need, these kind of improvements, this kind of capacity. I wouldn't say that there was 100% agreement about, what we were doing, but I think that people typically get more upset about not having a voice in the process than the process itself. And so I think that's the only thing you can do on that issue. As it relates to what we can do now, I think we have a different understanding, and maybe we're in a different place in time in terms of where the focus should be. I'd say for DC and maybe even for places like Denver, I've spent some time in some of your communities. I see the Colfax sign behind you. I've been on Colfax before, and I know some of the challenges that you're working through your community there. I just think it's an intentionality of where you put your dollars. I think you need to say, listen, the issue of equity is important to us. We're going to set aside, almost like what we did for environmental issues back 10, 20 years ago. I'm going to set aside budget to address those concerns that you have. I think that's at least a first step to show that, listen, we're hearing you, we're committed to addressing it. We want you to participate in helping us come up with solutions. And here's dollars we can work together to figure out what the solutions are and then implement with you, the community there. So I think that thankfully we're learning. I just want to give a shout out to people like Secretary Anthony Fox, who's using his platform having been the secretary of DOT, to make sure people know that this is a legitimate issue in neighborhoods all across the U.S. and we have a responsibility to address it. And I'm hopeful that we will do that better.
Absolutely. I say that equity really is an action. So definitely that's a good tidbit there. Let me I got one kind of segment that I wanted to talk to you about, and I'll just jump right into it. Since you mentioned the former U.S. DOT Secretary Anthony Fox, we now just got confirmation of Mayor Pete Buttigieg as the now newly appointed Secretary for the U.S. Department of Transportation. I think it's confirmation occurred not too long ago, a couple hours ago. And so what do you think about the new administration from a federal level that's come in, and the focus that I think, which is the focus on cities, and the fact that now serving in a secretary role for the DOT, and it's seemingly through his testimony and through even the Harris campaign, that there's really an energy around infrastructure, around he's helping to kind of build back better and the like. So I'm curious, and to the federal establishment there, kind of, how do you feel about the new administration coming in?
No, I feel really good. I think a couple things about the secretary really come to mind. I do think that mayors in particular, because of the responsibilities of their role to kind of solve problems for their cities, they tend to be action oriented. And so I do think that for the transportation industry, having somebody that comes into the job oriented towards action is really good. Secondly, I think it's impossible to not hear him speak and how he thinks to appreciate he's a very bright, intelligent man, and he's going to be very thoughtful about how we approach the challenge for infrastructure investment. And maybe then even beyond that, I mean, he's really picked a good team. There's a couple of names that I know personally on the team, and they bring a really good breadth of experience, depth across the full spectrum of all the issues that US DOT has to face. And I'll try to put a balanced response to infrastructure, because every first year of every presidential administration, we do talk about infrastructure. So I'll just say that I'm going to be somewhat measured, but I do believe that the language that I'm hearing around a once in a generation opportunity to kind of reframe and rethink how we do infrastructure and transportation, that's encouraging. I think the issues of climate and equity are being baked in at the beginning, and I think that's encouraging. Obviously, given where I sit on a day-to-day basis as a private owner-operator of infrastructure, we are hopeful that P3s as a tool/partnership with the governments, both states and cities, to move infrastructure forward remains a part of it. And I think I can see that as well. But I do think that this is, we're very fortunate. Like I'll call out a couple of people, and one person in particular. So I'm not sure if you know Christopher Coase. Christopher was at Locus, Smart Growth America initiative, and he comes to the job as principal deputy for policy, with a really great transport and real estate development perspective, which I think at the end of the day, just like we did in DC and like you're doing in Denver, real estate and transport investment go together. And so I think having people that think that way is going to be really important for how we invest and kind of shape our cities going forward. So I'm optimistic about what this team can do.
Yeah, there's a ton of excitement, not only with the secretary, but also the team that have been selected for serving in leadership roles across the department. And so it's great to see the city influence, great to see some professionals in those particular positions, and I think we have an opportunity to really kind of push not only ourselves, but push the administration to try to figure out ways that we can have that once in a lifetime and that generational kind of catalyst of infrastructure that the country needs. And so it's going to be interesting to see kind of what comes out from the federal standpoint, but I know we're kind of locked and loaded here and ready to go. I know here in Denver and in the state of Colorado, there's a ton of after trying to figure out ways to get back to a level of recovery due to the pandemic. Infrastructure is always going to be a great catalyst for jobs and a region's and the state's economy. So everybody's looking forward to this.
So let me before we
yeah, go
before we
ahead.
move on, I just want to name check Brad Mims. Obviously, COMTO should be very
Yes.
proud one of its own as in the FAA, and also name check Maurice Henderson, who's working as a senior advisor to the Secretary. Maurice is former Portland transport leadership and another one of the DC alumnus.
Absolutely, it's amazing. I spoke with Maurice not too long ago and congratulated him on his position, and definitely, yeah, COMTO's own.
Yeah.
Brad Mims taking that role over at FAA. So it just really it's great and good to see the impact of not only organizations like COMTO and COMTO membership. Think about Phil Washington, who was the head of the transition team. I mean, so having the people at the table that understand these issues that are important to COMTO and important to cities is just it be extremely impactful. And so I think there's a lot of excitement, and the people I talk to, everybody's ready to go. So we're gonna have some influence there moving forward. I would like to get your thoughts based on your experience, but explain to the folks kind of what your role is at Transurban and certain projects that you're currently working on.
Absolutely. So Transurban is it's an Australian-based global infrastructure owner and investor and operator. I work for the North American business. We're headquartered in Washington, D.C., and we currently own and operate the 495, which is the Capital Beltway, the 395 and 95 express lanes. Express lanes are high occupancy toll lanes that basically sit within the right-of-way, and they're lanes set aside for people either willing to pay a toll to use them, they're managed lanes, willing to pay a toll to use them, or for people riding in high occupancy HOV3 vehicles. And so really what it does, it provides a release valve from congestion corridors for people willing to pay for predictability on their travels along that facility. And so we're one of the 5 largest toll road owners and operators in the world. The majority of our assets are in Australia, but we're really focused on a lot of growth in North America. And so we've currently bid on the Maryland Express lanes, which will connect with our existing facilities in Virginia, connect around the Beltway, and then up 270, which is another large highway that goes northwest away from Washington, D.C. And we're very much in the market for other assets, both in the DMV, as we like to say here, but our ambitions are also to be in other parts of the U.S. geography. Another interesting part of our business, and this is really very much in the space that I work in, is that we're really focused on what technologies related to our business can we both develop and partner with people to build, or also just look for ways to improve the operation of our assets. So technology around mobile and digital tools to interface with toll facilities. As you may know, we were looking at vehicle miles traveled as a replacement funding source for the gas tax in the future. We've been doing studies and research and pilots around road user charging. I'm not sure if they're doing it in Colorado, but I know they're doing it in Utah for sure. And so we've been developing pilots, which we're doing in Virginia, as well as up and down the Northeast corridor. So that's actually the really exciting part of my job, is to not only support the facilities we own and operate, the assets, toll roads that we're pursuing in the more immediate term, but also looking out to the future, driving our R&D program, and looking for, what does transportation in the future look like? Mobility as a service. How do we leverage technology? So it's a pretty interesting and pretty wide-ranging role that I have, which I enjoy quite a bit.
That's good. And that industry and the tolling industry is going to be something that's going to be a need moving forward, because as budgets can completely become constrained, and as there's more evaluation of other ways to raise your revenue to build out or expand ways, you have to let all the tools in the tool industry to be a part of, not only here in the U.S. and you're in the Washington, D.C. area, but I think in many states and cities across the country, it's going to be a need to try to evaluate what's the best and most appropriate way to actually pay for infrastructure needs throughout the country. So it's good stuff. Let me ask you about the technology, and you mentioned kind of some of the tool technology to make it a little bit easier to use a facility. But what other kind of thoughts do you have around new technologies, just in general, not irrespective of kind of a tolling facility? Is there something that we need to be aware of, or you have your eye on that leaders in the transportation industry need to be cognizant of?
Yeah, well, the one thing that I spent a lot of time thinking about when I was at WMATA is, and even at DDOT, is that the fact that most people, especially in cities, use all modes of transportation. You're not typically just going to use your car every day, or you're not just going to use public transit every day. It's actually going to be on a day-by-day, case-by-case basis. Some days it makes sense for you to grab a bike or a scooter to take a short trip. Some days you want to drive into work because you have something else. So we've thought, I think as an industry, a lot about mobility as a service within the confines of public transit and other. I think especially in large metropolitan areas like a Denver, right, where people are both going to the suburbs but coming into the cities, broadening that mobility as a service opportunity to include roadways like tolling is something I think in the future we're going to all want to be able to move however we choose to move, but be able to pay seamlessly. Not pull out a credit card, but it's probably we're going to want to use our mobile device to do whatever that movement is, whether it's rent something, pay to get into a station and ride something, or pay to move on our vehicle through an area. So I think a lot about kind of what the customer wants. And I think that's one of the interesting things, I think, being on the private sector side, you start to think a lot more about value that your customer wants to experience and what the experience with your mode is. And so I think if people want better experiences, we want to give them really a frictionless way to access that all. So I think that's one play. I do think that with 5G coming online, I think the notion of IoT, Internet of Things, just the interconnected of all the infrastructure and its ability to be able to allow all these transactions to take place is going to be really foundational to what we start to think of. I can imagine, there's pilots in some parts of downtowns, like highly used corridors, where you're trying to make that as connected of a space as you can. You want people to walk through it and have the best possible internet coverage. And you have so many benefits. You can use that to manage throughput. You can use that to manage communication. So I think that's some of the things I think about where we can bring some of our experiences. The last one, which in DC tends to be very controversial, is this notion of congestion pricing. We know that cities like New York, cities like Los Angeles, and even I think all cities are going to start to kind of, think a little bit more about whether or not congestion pricing as a tool to both manage congestion, manage air quality, and just deal with the funding requirements of maintaining infrastructure starts to kind of come back on the table. So I do think that going back to the USDOT, they have a lot of interesting opportunities. And I say the technology is so far advanced now that these things are not just good ideas. They're actually very possible. They're very attainable if there's a focus and a commitment to do it.
Good. Yeah. I love the term frictionless that you use in terms of payment. I think really that term needs to be applied to all mobility modes, right? So that's one of the things we're trying to figure out here in Denver is how do you have a better integrated system? And going back to Phil Washington again, he always talks about trying to be a mobility integrator, and that's what a transit agency is supposed to be about. It's just not the bus. It's all how does the different modal services that can be one in which user can easily make a decision on which mode that they want to choose, and that can get them to where they need to go in a safe and efficient manner. So yeah, I really appreciate that. I appreciate the way you described it as well. That should be a focus for us. Going back to quick, as a follow-up question about your thoughts around the kind of future of transit after the pandemic here, and your experience with WMATA, especially during that time where there was a concern with just overall system safety. I remember back in the day there, during your time there. And in fact, what's interesting, we COMTO Colorado and WTS last week held a welcoming reception for Deborah John, who I know that you know of, and she had spent some time there at WMATA, and she was talking about the safety concerns back in that time as well. But I would be curious, this is another type of safety. This is not operational safety. This has to deal with a safe for passengers and operators in a post-pandemic world. But I'm curious, how do you think transit is going to survive or take shape here in a post-pandemic environment?
First, let me just say a big congrats to Deborah. I had the good fortune of working with her pretty early in both of our careers in DC, and I think she's going to be a great leader for RTD going forward. So big kudos to her. But yeah, looking at the future of transit, I mean, I think I'd say there's a couple of things, right? Obviously, the first and fundamental responsibility of all transportation organizations is safety. And so thinking about the best way to safeguard our workers, our employees as they ride the system, and at the same time, that's going to be directly related to the users of the system, because at least in the pandemic, the most lethal kind of issue we're dealing with is people coming onto the system that are not safe and not adhering to safety requirements as passengers. I do think that there's an interesting connection in my mind between the roadway solutions that I talked about before and transit. So one of the things that we've done as an organization, and it's really been interesting for me, is there is a really strong corporate sustainability focus from our business, really thinking about what is our responsibility as a company to make sure that the social goals of the community that we operate in are being adhered to. And one of the ways that manifests itself, at least in Virginia, is our commitment to make payments to the state to fund transit. So I think we're somewhat unique in that regard, where we are a partner with the state of Virginia in investing in transit, so they can make decisions about where they allocate that funding. I do think in an ideal future world, if you think about all of our transportation networks being connected, it seems very reasonable to think about some of the revenues coming from roadways users that are potentially, if they're not in electric vehicles, generating some of the carbon challenges we have, using that and tying that directly to support the business model for transit. I think that you can very easily make that connection in your mind. I do think that one of the things that we will have to do, and this is the harder part, frankly, going back to the equity conversation, is that there's going to be a question about the transit business model. I do think that we can't go through this period and not have every transit agency look at its business model and see if there's ways that it can both protect its riders, its workers, and still do so in a way that can be funded. And so I think what I'm seeing from the federal government is there's clearly a commitment to build a bridge to support transit agencies through this most difficult time of COVID. But I do think that most of the agencies are thinking about, well, okay, post-COVID, post-federal support for COVID, how do we continue forward? How do we have a viable, sustainable funding structure going forward? And I think the ones that are doing that homework now are going to be the best position for transitioning out of, whatever this trough looks like and the support going away from the federal level. So, yeah, I think that this a really important time, and at some level, the future of our cities is dependent on some of these solutions.
Absolutely, and it's interesting that the funding solution that you made mention of that's tied back to sustainability, and basically having folks contribute to a more environmentally friendly mode of transportation. It's an interesting approach, and I'm wondering, who's taking a look at that, and it's something that should be a part of this now renewed discussion around infrastructure. I think the Gas Act, everybody knows, is going downhill. I think as the electrification of many vehicles and many fleets come on board, it's just going to ways to have more unique revenue raises from actual user basis that you then want to change behavior is what is going to drive a lot of policy decisions moving forward. So that's an interesting one. I haven't heard that one before, but it's something that we all need to be thinking about moving forward. What type of advice that you would have for up-and-coming people and the up-and-coming professionals in the industry around leadership, so they can be prepared for the same type of roles that you've had? Yeah. What is your leadership style that you used to be successful?
No, I appreciate that. That's a good question. I think that, coming from a team sport background, I think that that really influenced kind of how I grew up and how I think I learned to lead. And, typically on teams, that captain, that leadership role, it's very much servant leadership, where they're the ones that are setting the pace, setting the tone, but they're also part of a team and letting people kind of bring their skills to bear. So I think I've tried to model the mentor-coach approach where, my job is to work with the team and our bosses to figure out where we're going and kind of point to the mountain and say, this is where we're heading. But the goal is to put together a good team where people bring different skills, different perspectives to bear, and we're all counting on each other to bring those things to bear. So I would say that that's what I've tried to foster, is a supporter, a mentor, a coach at times. I'm not going to know everything that you know, and I probably shouldn't. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense for us to have different jobs. I'd also say that leaders aren't just people with titles, right? I think that's one of the things that I'd say this to everybody, especially the more junior people listening in, is that you can be at any place in your organization and can be a leader. And that's really how you show up, how you contribute, and how you treat people. That can set a tone, help set a culture for an organization or for a team. And that's really where you get to start to both try on kind of what your leadership style looks like. So raise your hand where there's an opportunity, put in the work, be a teammate to people. I think that is sometimes undervalued, that actually kind of playing your role is actually a good part of being a leader. I'd say that the last thing I would say is that, there are great opportunities like places like COMTO where you can both build that network so that you can have places to go for feedback, for support. Just one kind of critique as I look back, I think you're right. I was really fortunate to be put in leadership positions fairly early in my career. And I will admit that at times it felt like I was the only one that was in that role and kind of isolated in that space. And so I did find, places like COMTO, NFPPA, places where I could find others to kind of be that support and kind of that reassurance. And frankly, that place you can go talk about things that you can't talk about in your organization. You have to have that place. And so I would encourage people, whether you're a leader of an organization or a leader within your organization, it's good to build relationships outside of your organization, because you can actually say things there that you might not be able, or you're not prepared to yet say within your organization, and kind of try them out. And then also kind of just level set and ground truth what you're seeing in your experience from others that have been there before you. And then the last thing I would say, and you mentioned this, I think mentorship it's a give and take, and you should seek to be a mentor to somebody, and you should seek to be mentored to. I've been really fortunate to find a number of mentors throughout my career, and they're not static, right? They evolve over time because you are evolving over time. A mentor for one period of time may not be a mentor when you're in a different place in your career, and that's okay. It becomes a different relationship.
Absolutely, that's fantastic advice, Emeka. And I love the point about learning and playing your role as a teammate. I think a lot of times we think we get in these quote unquote important or high titled leadership positions, and we have to be the first ones to speak up and speak out and speak loudest. And sometimes that's not necessary, right? So knowing your role, and you can be a strong leader if you play your position on the team well and be a good teammate. So that's fantastic. And the mentorship piece, like I said, you've been a mentor of mine, and it's been truly appreciated. And it's my responsibility to kind of pass that on as well to other people that are trying to accelerate their career within the industry. So all great advice, and truly appreciate it.
Eulois, let me just say this before you transition out. I couldn't let this time go forward without saying that, it's going to sound a little cheesy, but I've been incredibly impressed and proud to watch you just kind of go from strength to strength in your career, leaving the DC area and kind of forging new space. And so it's been a privilege to watch you grow and expand your skill set and your opportunities. And so I'm looking forward to seeing what the next chapter looks like for you whenever that starts.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I'm looking for that too. Whatever that is. So, but yeah, Emeka, we're gonna try to wrap it up here. But that's great a relationship that I have with Emeka. We do have one issue, and we used to argue about this all of the time. Emeka, for some reason, Yeah, I'm gonna bring it up. Emeka, for some reason, thinks that the best athletes in the world are people that kick a soccer ball, and I think the best athletes in the world are the ones that put a ball through a hoop. So I don't know if you want to defend yourself here or not, but it's questionable. All my folks here are looking at you like you're crazy as well. So do you want to spend some time to defend yourself on the LIT podcast here? Why do you think that soccer players are better athletes than basketball players?
So here's what I'll lay out these facts for you for consideration. How about that? So one, the highest viewed sporting event every 4 years is the World Cup. It's watched by more people across the world than any event. Two, actually, check out the NBA. See how many of those players are following their favorite soccer player, whether it be Messi, Ronaldo, whoever the player is. So no disrespect. I was a former high school basketball player, not quite to the same level as you, Eulois. Full respect for the sport. I just ask for the same respect for my chosen sport of soccer.
there you go. But and you had a storied soccer career, right?
I did. I played a little bit in college and a little bit afterwards.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah. So it's understandable. So at least you have an appreciation for both. I never really played soccer. I just thought it was a bunch of guys kicking a ball. But
there's still time for you to work on that. We can still work on that.
And the way I see some of the players now react when they get fouled, I think I see a little bit of soccer on the hardwood court now. So a lot of flopping going on.
No, I would joke. So LeBron is our biggest advertiser in the NBA. You know, he partially owns he owns a part of Liverpool FC in England. He's a huge soccer.
Oh yeah. Wow, there you go. So that's where he gets it from. Got you. Okay.
Exactly.
Well, hey, Emeka, man, it's been fun, man. This has been really good, and I appreciate your time. I know we're all busy, and I enjoy learning from you every single time I talk to you. So we'll be talking, outside of this podcast, but hopefully everybody who watched this learned a lot about you, your past endeavors in the industry, and some of your thoughts around what we need to focus on moving forward. So thank you for your insight and your time today.
I appreciate it, and I appreciate you, Eulois. Take care.
Good. Definitely. So that's going to wrap it up for the COMTO Colorado LIT Podcast, otherwise known as the Leaders in Transportation Podcast. I'm Eulois Cleckley, Executive Director of the Denver Department of Transportation and the current Chapter President of the Colorado COMTO Chapter. And remember, COMTO Colorado is here to make sure that you are building, organizing, learning, and earning your way to a great transportation career. So that being said, signing off. Good day.